Hey everyone, tonight we're entering a world most Americans would never believe exists. A world where friends are watched, whispers are recorded, and loyalty can be a trap. They moved unseen through campuses, protests, and neighborhoods, cataloging lives as if every thought was a threat. And no one knew who to trust, not even the people they called neighbors. This is the story of Operation Chaos, the CIA's secret eyes on its own citizens. Before we begin, hit like and subscribe if you crave history with its shadows exposed. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is in your city. Let's see who's daring to drift into these hidden corridors of American history. Now, slow your thoughts. Tonight we're stepping into the tension of the 1970s, where every protest could be a target, every conversation could be overheard, and one man, Agent X, walks the fine line between conscience and duty. The fog lay thick over the campus, curling in silent, twisting fingers that shrouded the quad in a silver-gray haze. The lampposts flickered in the night, their weak light casting long, quivering shadows across the concrete paths. A few students lingered after a late seminar, their voices low, whispers slithering across the lawns like cautious predators. The night smelled faintly of wet leaves and autumn decay, of ink and chalk from the day's lessons. But beneath it all was something else, a tension they could not name. Somewhere a branch snapped, then a shadow moved. There was a weight in the air, a subtle pressure, as if someone was watching, always watching, though they could not see them. The students' conversation turned to the protests scheduled for the next morning. They spoke of banners and chants, of speeches that would carry their anger into the streets. They spoke of injustice, of a country entangled in a war half a world away, of a government deaf to the voices that rose against it. They laughed nervously, not realizing that laughter itself could be a signal, a data point in someone else's ledger. In the shadows, he moved. Not a ghost, not yet, but close to it. His coat blended into the darkness, his shoes silent against the damp concrete. Cameras hid in the branches above, lenses trained with mechanical precision on faces that meant nothing to him personally, but everything to those he worked for. Each step he took was calculated, deliberate. Every flicker of movement in his peripheral vision noted, analyzed, cataloged. There was a briefcase under a nearby doorway, left intentionally, sliding with careful hands across the threshold. Inside it were microfilm reels, each containing pages of names, addresses, affiliations, and observations, every detail meticulously gathered and packaged for consumption by a bureaucracy that valued data over human life. What if the people charged with defending your country were secretly watching you? The thought whispered in his mind. He had asked it himself countless times, and each time it felt more like a knife twisting in a private corner of his conscience. Tonight, he would add another layer of observation, another piece to the puzzle that was slowly but surely taking over the lives of those who thought themselves free. Across the campus, students moved on, unaware. Their conversations drifted from planning to speculation to idle jokes. One of them paused, sensing something in the night, a glance over her shoulder. Nothing was there. She laughed softly, convincing herself she was imagining shadows where none existed. Yet she could not shake the prickling unease, the sense that a presence hovered just beyond perception. In that moment, the unseen watcher smiled inwardly. He knew they would never know how close they had come, how easily the night could have changed everything. The operation had begun quietly, without notice, without permission. No law had sanctioned it. No court had authorized it. And yet it proceeded, step by calculated step, creeping into the lives of citizens who had done nothing but speak, plan, and hope for a better world. The machinery of observation whirred invisibly, gears grinding, mechanisms clicking, every human movement accounted for, every word potentially dangerous, every glance a secret signal. In a nearby office, a desk lamp glowed, illuminating stacks of dossiers and surveillance reports. Names scrawled in tight script lined the margins. Leaders, organizers, agitators, unknown sympathizers. Each folder represented a person whose life was being dissected, analyzed, quantified, reduced to intelligence, reduced to risk. Somewhere, Agent X pored over these files, a composite of skill, intellect, and doubt, moving through the maze of bureaucracy with the cold precision demanded of him while his mind warred against the ethical erosion that crept with each assignment. He had been briefed earlier that week. Infiltrate the student protest group, observe, report, identify foreign contacts, maintain cover at all costs. Failure was not just personal. It could mean exposure, scandal, even death. He knew enough to understand the stakes, and yet he also knew that every step deeper into this world meant another step away from his own moral compass. The protest group was small, just a dozen students, yet each one held potential intelligence. Their rhetoric, their affiliations, their ideologies, all were carefully cataloged, analyzed, interpreted. Agent X had watched them from a distance, attended lectures, lingered in the halls under pretense, gradually inserting himself into their orbit. They did not see him, or rather, they saw only what he allowed them to see. A student like any other, an ally in shared causes, a friendly face among their ranks. The first assignment came unexpectedly. A new student had arrived, claiming to have connections abroad. She spoke of travels to Europe, of encounters with activists in Germany and France, of correspondence with groups whose intentions were murky at best. Her enthusiasm was genuine, or at least convincingly so. Agent X filed her statements, cross-referenced names, and noted inconsistencies. Somewhere in his mind, doubt stirred. Was this truly a foreign contact, or merely an idealistic youth hungry for experience? The uncertainty was part of the design. The thrill, the danger, the uncertainty of intelligence work. Each day blurred into the next. Surveillance reports accumulated like layers of dust, unreadable except to those trained to see patterns where others saw only noise. Agent X cataloged meetings, letters, phone calls, and casual conversations. He attended rallies and lectures, watched from the shadows as speeches were delivered with fervor, and felt the adrenaline surge every time someone nearly discovered his purpose. Each close call left him hollowed, tense, acutely aware of the fragility of the balance between observation and detection. He became increasingly aware of his own duplicity, the way he was living two lives simultaneously. Among the students, he was engaged, sympathetic, caring even. Yet in the reports he submitted, he cataloged them coldly, as data points, as potential threats. The dissonance gnawed at him. The line between right and wrong blurred beneath the weight of duty and secrecy. And yet, for every pang of conscience, there was a counterweight, the knowledge that failure could ripple beyond him, affecting colleagues, operations, even the nation's perception of its own security. Late one evening, as he sat in the dim light of his apartment, poring over microfilm and notes, a single realization struck him with the force of inevitability. No one was truly safe. Not the students in the quad, not the activists organizing quietly in basements and dorm rooms, not even the agents themselves. Every word, every action, every thought could be intercepted, misinterpreted, weaponized. And in that realization lay the true horror of the operation. Its reach was absolute, and its morality uncertain. That night, Agent X walked the empty streets, careful to remain unseen, acutely aware of every shadow, every flicker of light, every sound that could betray him. He imagined the students asleep in their dorms, unaware of how close the gaze of the agency was, how thin the barrier between normal life and complete intrusion had become. He felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. It was the cold knowledge that he was part of a system that was already watching, already judging, already deciding the fates of those who had done nothing wrong. By morning, the students would awaken, discuss their plans, organize their banners and chants, completely oblivious to the night's silent watchers. Agent X would submit his reports, each observation meticulously logged, each suspicion recorded, each potential foreign contact noted and flagged for further investigation. Somewhere, his supervisors would read, digest, and act, shaping events in ways that would ripple far beyond the campus, far beyond the students themselves. And somewhere, in the quiet spaces of conscience and doubt, Agent X asked himself again the question that would haunt him through every assignment. Was he defending his country, or was he eroding the very freedoms he claimed to protect? The answer was elusive, tangled in shadows and secrecy, and yet he had no choice but to continue, step by measured step, deeper into the labyrinth of espionage. The first assignment concluded with a minor success. A foreign contact was identified, connections documented, patterns observed, but the victory was hollow. Uncertainty lingered. Was the contact truly a threat, or merely a misinterpreted interaction, a coincidence blown into significance by the lens of suspicion? The ambiguity gnawed at him, a psychological weight that no amount of protocol or procedure could alleviate. The operation had begun, but the true challenge was only starting. As the sun crept over the horizon, mist clinging to the campus like a lingering secret, Agent X disappeared into the morning bustle. Students streamed past, unaware, voices carrying with the untainted optimism of youth. Somewhere in a nondescript office far from the quad, files were updated, microfilm reels cataloged, and the machinery of observation pressed forward, inexorable and silent. The line between observer and participant, between protector and betrayer, between moral duty and ethical compromise, had already begun to blur. And in that blurred line lay the suspense, the danger, and the haunting truth of Operation Chaos. No one knew how deep the operation would reach. No one knew which lives would be touched, broken, or irrevocably changed. And as Agent X watched, calculated, and reported, a single persistent thought took root. One misstep, one misinterpretation, one exposure could unravel everything. The game had begun, and the rules were written in shadows. The game had begun, and the rules were written in shadows. Agent X moved through the following weeks with a careful precision that left no room for error. Each step choreographed yet instinctual, each interaction measured to maintain the illusion of belonging while safeguarding the secrets that tethered him to a world hidden from ordinary eyes. The students accepted him without question. He laughed at jokes he did not fully understand, nodded at plans he had no intention of fully sharing, and memorized the contours of faces and voices with the cold, unflinching diligence of someone trained to see patterns where others saw only life. And yet, beneath the practiced calm, beneath the documentation and microfilm reports, a tension simmered. Every time someone spoke of their hopes, their dreams, their anger at a war thousands of miles away, he felt a subtle tightening in his chest, a faint but insistent echo of conscience that refused to be silenced. The first rally he attended as a participant, under the pretense of a new recruit eager to contribute, was the sort of moment that defined the duality of his existence. The streets were alive with fervor, the air thick with chants, and the scent of autumn leaves crushed beneath marching feet. Signs demanded justice, peace, and recognition. Voices rang with conviction, and the energy was contagious, a current that pulled at the edges of his moral armor. Agent X noted names, gestures, allegiances, and oddities, logging them mentally even as he allowed himself the smallest acknowledgement of admiration. There was courage here, raw and unpolished, and for a fleeting second he wondered how the machinery of espionage could justify turning this into intelligence. Infiltration was not merely attendance, it was immersion. Meetings in small apartments, conversations over coffee in dimly lit cafes, long nights cataloging strategies for upcoming protests, and casual interactions that required perfect recall of previous statements. All of these were exercises in duplicity, in maintaining a life that was simultaneously genuine and fabricated. And within this web, Agent X began to notice subtle dynamics. The way certain voices carried weight despite their youth, the nervous glances exchanged over coded references, the way alliances formed and broke apart with the delicacy of spider silk. Among the activists were those unknowingly working alongside informants, double agents whose loyalty lay elsewhere, but whose presence was concealed under the guise of shared ideology. Identifying them became a puzzle, layered atop a puzzle, a mental game that kept him alert, yet increasingly frayed. There were moments of near discovery that left his pulse hammering long after they had passed. One evening, during a heated planning session for a civil rights march, an activist who had begun to sense discrepancies in his stories paused mid-sentence, her eyes narrowing as if to measure the truth behind his carefully rehearsed responses. Agent X smiled, nodded, laughed at the appropriate time, and steered the conversation into mundane logistical details. The seconds stretched interminably, every heartbeat a drum of potential exposure. And when she finally relaxed, the relief was almost physical, a small victory against the ever-present threat of being unmasked. His nights were spent reviewing hidden microphones, cross-referencing coded phrases, and studying movements captured by surveillance cameras strategically placed months before. Every whisper, every sigh, every incidental remark became a potential clue. The operation demanded not only observation, but also interpretation, and interpretation was fraught with danger. Misread a gesture, mishear a phrase, or misjudge a person's intent, and an innocent individual could be marked, their life altered, their trust betrayed. And still, he pressed on, caught between duty and a slowly growing empathy that gnawed at the edges of his resolve. Empathy arrived quietly, insidiously, through small acts of courage and vulnerability that no intelligence report could quantify. A student stayed behind after a rally to counsel a younger participant, her voice gentle yet firm, insisting that passion be tempered with care. A leader from another group risked arrest to shield a less experienced activist from the police, offering guidance without condescension. Witnessing these moments, Agent X felt a constriction in his chest, an unease born not of fear for his own safety, but of awareness that he was simultaneously cataloging these virtues and using them as ammunition for the operation. Each act of bravery, each flicker of humanity made the duplicity heavier and the psychological tension sharper. Double agents operated around him like shadows within shadows, their loyalty hidden beneath layers of feigned camaraderie. One young man had become close to him, speaking of travels abroad, of causes that spanned continents, of correspondence with individuals whose political alignment was a matter of intense scrutiny. Agent X recorded every detail, noting inconsistencies, timing, and associations, yet he began to recognize the humanity behind the files. He imagined the fear that coursed through this young man, the uncertainty of living a life split between performance and conviction, and felt a pang that was new, unwelcome, and dangerously sympathetic. Conversations became exercises in subtext. A casual reference to an upcoming lecture might conceal a planned protest. A joke about a politician could hide the logistics of an organized demonstration. Agent X had to navigate these layers, respond naturally, maintain credibility, and simultaneously feed every observed nuance back into the ever-growing database of intelligence. There was exhilaration in the challenge, but also a creeping dread, the sort that seeped into the edges of sleep, leaving dreams haunted by faces, voices, and unspoken truths. One night, after a long meeting, Agent X walked alone through a campus alley. The wind carried faint echoes of chants from students heading home, their energy undiminished by the night. He thought about the young woman whose confidence inspired the group, the cautious leader whose decisions shaped the rally, and the double agent whose allegiance was a carefully concealed secret. Each was a piece of a puzzle, each a variable in a system he both controlled and was constrained by. He realized then that empathy was no longer an intrusion. It was an uninvited companion, a silent judge of his actions, and a source of constant inner conflict. The operation demanded discipline, yet every act of discretion came with a cost. He began to question small decisions, weighing the consequences of reporting particular statements or gestures? Could a joke about foreign travel really signify danger, or was it mere bravado? Did a whispered conversation in a dorm room conceal international intrigue, or was it the unremarkable chatter of youth? Each assessment carried the potential to mark someone, to alter their trajectory in ways that would remain invisible to the targets themselves. There were moments when the line between observation and participation blurred. He laughed at the students' frustrations with bureaucracy, offered ideas in planning sessions, and occasionally felt genuine camaraderie. And yet, every thought, every reaction, every subtle display of trust was a potential liability, fodder for the intelligence apparatus he served. The duplicity became a second skin, heavy and uncomfortable, and yet indispensable. Close calls multiplied. During a strategy discussion about a series of rallies across the city, an activist inadvertently mentioned a detail that contradicted what Agent X had observed. The pause that followed felt like eternity. Eyes flicked, suspicions whispered beneath the surface of smiles, and for a brief instant he feared exposure. Then the conversation shifted, the moment passed, and he recorded the discrepancy in his notebook, noting its potential significance for higher authorities. The adrenaline lingered, a constant undertow beneath the veneer of composure. As the weeks unfolded, Agent X's empathy deepened, complicating every report, every judgment. He recognized bravery, compassion, and integrity in those he was meant to scrutinize and catalog, creating a conflict that no protocol could resolve. Was the mission truly about foreign influence, or had it become an intrusion into the very fabric of human connection? The question persisted, unanswerable, and yet it did not stop the operation. Surveillance techniques evolved alongside his own understanding. Hidden microphones captured whispered confidences, cameras in borrowed apartments tracked meetings, coded phrases replaced casual greetings, and aliases proliferated. Every detail became intelligence, every human interaction a potential lead. Yet, amidst the rigor of methodology, the unpredictability of emotion remained uncontrollable, defying analysis, frustrating the mission, and awakening in him a growing awareness of the cost borne by both the observers and the observed. The tension reached new heights during a citywide rally that brought together multiple groups, each with its own ideology, its own network of informants, its own vulnerabilities. The air was thick with anticipation, chants reverberated down avenues, and Agent X maneuvered carefully, cataloging alliances, noting suspicious interactions, and assessing risks. A slip of a phrase from one student almost exposed a network of double agents. A misdirected glance could have compromised months of work. The suspense was palpable, the stakes immediate, and every heartbeat a reminder of how fragile the equilibrium of secrecy truly was. Late that night, in a dimly lit room filled with microfilm reels and surveillance reports, Agent X sat with a notebook open, hands trembling slightly from the strain. He cataloged names, recorded conversations, and annotated photographs with meticulous care. But beneath the work, beneath the discipline, was a gnawing unease, an awareness that empathy, once suppressed, had gained foothold, and that the very humanity he observed might one day conflict irreparably with his orders. And as he prepared to leave the office, the city still alive with the echoes of protest, he felt the weight of every choice, every observation, every concealed truth. The operation had drawn him into a web of deceit, loyalty, and moral ambiguity that extended far beyond the streets, far beyond the protests, and far beyond the lives he had been tasked to monitor. Somewhere, in the quiet, persistent whisper of conscience, he wondered whether the line between protector and betrayer had already vanished, and whether the next misstep would be irrevocable. He walked the empty streets towards his apartment, shadows clinging close, and every sound, the distant siren, the rustle of leaves, the murmur of late-night voices, felt like a signal. He walked the empty streets toward his apartment, shadows clinging close, and every sound, the distant siren, the rustle of leaves, the murmur of late-night voices, felt like a signal, a whisper of consequences yet unseen. But even as the city hummed its restless nocturnal pulse, another dimension of the operation began to unfold, one that demanded not just observation, but judgment, strategy, and the cold calculus of potential disruption. The targets were no longer abstract names in files. They were individuals of influence, people whose words could mobilize thousands, whose actions could shift the fragile balance between chaos and order. Martin Luther King Jr., Cesar Chavez, Rodolfo Corky Gonzalez, figures whose public presence masked a network of private interactions, alliances, and ambitions. The agency had decided that understanding, tracking, and cataloging their every move was not optional. It was imperative. A sense of exhilaration and dread coiled within Agent X as he received the dossier for the first time. The files were thick with notes, wiretap transcripts, intercepted letters, coded communications, and background checks meticulously compiled by teams across the country. Every meeting, every speech, every fundraising event had been recorded, analyzed, and reduced to data points. Yet, behind the abstraction lay a human reality, one that he could not ignore. He studied the notes with a professional detachment that strained at his conscience, noting the frequency of Gonzalez's outreach to youth organizations, King's private conversations about political strategy, Chavez's labor negotiations, and personal correspondence. Every detail was potentially actionable, every insight a thread that could unravel reputations, organizations, or even lives. The operation's reach extended far beyond public visibility. College campuses, union halls, church basements, community centers, every venue became a node in a vast, invisible network. The principle guiding the agency was deceptively simple. Everything is data, everyone a potential threat. Agent X repeated it silently as a mantra, yet the repetition only sharpened the tension. To see the world this way required a suspension of empathy, an accommodation of moral compromise. Yet he found that he could not entirely sever himself from the humanity behind the files. Each leader he studied, each activist he cataloged, became a figure of nuance, of layered motives, of personal stakes that no report could fully capture. A private conversation of a prominent activist was intercepted almost by accident one evening. The informant had overheard a discussion that seemed innocuous at first, an argument about the logistics of a local demonstration. But, as the minutes passed, subtle implications emerged. The activist mentioned potential contacts in Europe, names that were unfamiliar, phrases that suggested an exchange of ideas that could be interpreted as subversive. Agent X's hands were steady as he recorded it, yet the pit in his stomach refused to be quelled. He knew that acting too soon could destroy lives, while doing nothing could leave a real threat unchecked. The ethical calculus was impossible. Each decision carried consequences that no training could fully anticipate. The targets themselves were unaware of the gaze that followed them with relentless precision. Martin Luther King Jr. planned meetings with advisors, discussed strategy with confidants, and spoke in private about fears and aspirations that no one outside the inner circle should have known. Cesar Chavez negotiated with labor organizers, balancing idealism against pragmatism, unaware that each subtle gesture, each whispered remark, was being meticulously logged. Rodolfo Gonzalez debated tactics with young activists, laying the groundwork for movements that he hoped would empower communities, entirely blind to the shadowed observers who cataloged their intentions, motives, and weaknesses. Agent X moved among these intersecting worlds with a growing sense of unease. He attended community gatherings, ostensibly as a participant, while mentally parsing each conversation for intelligence value. A phrase spoken lightly over coffee, a subtle glance exchanged across a room, a pattern of attendance at meetings, all were potential indicators of influence or threat. Each day he wrestled with the psychological strain of balancing empathy against duty, observation against interference, engagement against invisibility. There were moments when the precision of surveillance collided with the unpredictability of human behavior. An activist paused mid-sentence, seemingly reconsidering a statement that had already been logged. A leader diverted the conversation in a way that rendered previous analysis incomplete. A group shifted plans at the last minute, altering routes, schedules, and allegiances. Every alteration required immediate recalibration, every misstep risked exposure, and every decision carried moral weight. Agent X found himself questioning whether intelligence could ever truly account for the human variable, whether the mission's abstract goals justified the intrusion into lives so fully lived. The danger was not hypothetical. One evening, during a clandestine observation of a small gathering, a misstep by a junior informant threatened to reveal their presence. A door opened too loudly, a conversation drifted too far into public view. And for a brief, suspended heartbeat, Agent X imagined the unraveling consequences. The gathering paused, heads turned, tension thickened, and he had to intervene subtly, redirecting attention with carefully chosen words and gestures. The moment passed, but the adrenaline lingered, a reminder that control was always provisional, that a single error could expose months of effort. Surveillance methods were increasingly sophisticated. Hidden microphones captured whispers in private spaces. Tailing agents maintained distance while monitoring every movement. Coded messages traveled through innocuous correspondence. Aliases proliferated, each carefully constructed identity a shield against exposure. Agent X studied these methods with analytical rigor, yet he also observed their effects on the targets. The stress, the suspicion, the occasional moments of cautious disclosure when confidants unknowingly placed trust in agents disguised as friends. Every method had consequence, and every consequence required consideration. The ethical tension deepened as the operation progressed. Information gleaned in confidence became data points. Acts of trust became evidence. Personal interactions became intelligence. Agent X struggled to reconcile his empathy with his mandate. The leaders he observed were not abstractions. They were human, capable of courage, vulnerability, error, and inspiration. Every report he submitted carried the weight of judgment, every assessment a potential instrument of harm. The duality of his role, friend and spy, participant and observer, pressed upon him with increasing intensity. In one case, a minor misinterpretation of a conversation led to an internal debate over whether intervention was necessary. The informant had overheard a discussion about securing funding for an outreach program, but the phrasing suggested a possible connection to foreign activists. The implications were ambiguous. Acting could prevent a perceived threat, but simultaneously harm the targets unjustly. Deliberation was agonizing, the line between prudence and moral compromise impossibly thin. The decision was deferred, yet the knowledge that inaction was itself a choice weighed heavily. The operation's scope widened, encompassing not just prominent leaders, but also secondary figures, student organizers, local advocates, and even casual sympathizers. Each individual's routine, interactions, and affiliations were noted, categorized, and analyzed. Agent X became intimately familiar with the rhythms of these communities, the ebb and flow of activism, and the intricate web of connections that bound movements together. He understood that the human element, the unpredictability, the resilience, the impulsive courage, was simultaneously the strength of these networks and the vulnerability the operation sought to exploit. As a new protest loomed on the horizon, tensions escalated. Intelligence suggested potential foreign influence, though evidence was scant and inconclusive. The agency debated its next steps, weighing the risks of preemptive action against the dangers of observation without intervention. Agent X monitored the planning, aware that any miscalculation could ignite a cascade of unintended consequences: arrests, exposure of informants, public scandal, and possibly violence. The suspense was suffocating, the stakes both immediate and diffuse, and every decision became a balancing act between prudence and overreach. He reviewed intercepted communications late into the night, noting subtle references, coded phrases, and anomalies. Each line required interpretation. Was this genuine concern, coded warning, or mere coincidence? The margin for error was vanishingly small. Misread intentions could destabilize movements or ruin lives, and the moral weight of that possibility pressed upon him like a physical presence. Sleep offered no relief. Dreams were infiltrated by snippets of conversation, echoes of meetings, and imagined confrontations that might never come. Agency discussions reflected the same tension. Analysts argued over the significance of patterns, debated the meaning of ambiguous messages, and proposed courses of action that were simultaneously necessary and ethically troubling. Agent X's input was valued, yet he felt increasingly isolated in understanding the human cost of operational decisions. He recognized that the true challenge was not merely gathering information, but managing its consequences without destroying the very lives it pertained to. A late-night strategy session brought the risk into sharper focus. A senior analyst proposed a preemptive intervention based on a minor misinterpreted detail from the previous week. Agent X hesitated, aware that executing such a plan could compromise innocent activists while also alerting genuine threats. His mind raced through contingencies, potential outcomes, and cascading effects, realizing that the line between defense and overreach had become perilously thin. He sensed that the next move, whatever it might be, would have far-reaching consequences. As dawn approached, he walked the quiet streets once more, considering the moral quagmire he inhabited. The targets, King, Chavez, Gonzalez, and the myriad activists orbiting their influence, were unaware of the surveillance, yet their lives were now entwined with it irrevocably. Every step, every interaction, every whispered plan had been cataloged, analyzed, and potentially weaponized. And yet, despite the operation's intrusion, their humanity persisted, their courage endured, and the ethical calculus remained unresolved. The impending protest loomed like a storm on the horizon. Intelligence was incomplete, foreign interference suspected but unconfirmed, and the potential for disaster hung palpably in the balance. Agent X knew that any misstep could escalate tensions, expose operatives, or compromise years of clandestine effort. The weight of decision pressed upon him relentlessly, each option fraught with peril, each inaction a potential failure. And in that tension, in the narrow margin between observation and intervention, the true horror of Operation Chaos became clear. The machinery of surveillance was complete, unblinking, and inexorably human in its imperfection. Every file, every note, every intercepted conversation held consequences that could ripple outward unpredictably, shaping lives, movements, and history itself. Agent X understood that the operation was no longer merely about intelligence. It was about control, influence, and the moral cost of unseen power. The next protest would unfold in hours, and the agency remained uncertain. They could act, or they could wait. They could intervene, or they could observe. Every choice was a risk, every action a potential betrayal. And as the city stirred awake, carrying the breathless anticipation of thousands who had no idea how close they were to being pawns in a game of secrets and shadows, Agent X felt the full weight of his role. He was no longer merely an observer. He was part of a chain whose consequences he could neither fully predict nor entirely prevent. The sun rose over the horizon, casting long lines of light that seemed almost cruel in their indifference to the tension beneath. Somewhere in the network, a message was dispatched, a note passed, a decision made. The operation waited, silent and unyielding, for the events of the day to unfold. And as Agent X took a moment to steady himself, he knew that the next hours would define not only the outcome of the protest, but also the fragile morality of every observer, every agent, and every human caught in the web of chaos. The storm was imminent, and there was no turning back. The storm had passed over the streets, but the tremors lingered, threading through every corner of the operation, wrapping themselves around Agent X like a tightening coil. Dawn had revealed nothing, and yet everything. A paradox that the intelligence world thrived upon. Files multiplied on his desk, not in hundreds, not in thousands, but in numbers that seemed almost unmanageable. 7,200 dossiers, each meticulously cross-referenced, each representing a life, a set of intentions, a network of connections spanning cities, states, and even countries. And yet, for all the thoroughness, there were gaps, holes in the surveillance, moments of inattention, ambiguities in behavior that no camera or microphone could fully capture. Agent X knew that somewhere in those gaps lay risk, and within those risks lay consequences that could ripple like unseen earthquakes through the lives of thousands. Collaboration with foreign intelligence networks had expanded the operation into a global lattice, a web that linked U.S. citizens traveling abroad, foreign activists visiting the States, and even expatriates whose allegiance was assumed to be pliable. Messages intercepted in Europe, letters opened under clandestine authority, coded telegrams diverted and catalogued, all fed into the ever-expanding repository. The sheer magnitude of it was dizzying, and the agency's mantra, "Everything is data, everyone a potential threat," reverberated louder than ever in his mind. Yet, even as the system grew more sophisticated, the human element remained maddeningly unpredictable. The network was powerful, but it was fragile. A single misstep, a misread signal, or an innocent misunderstanding could set off a cascade of panic and distrust. Mistakes began to appear almost immediately, small at first: misattributed phone numbers, misidentified faces, incorrectly interpreted coded messages. But their effects were amplified by the scale of the operation. A single agent in the field panicked after a misinterpreted conversation, reporting suspicious behavior that never existed. Another file suggested that a minor activist had foreign ties, when in reality the young person had simply corresponded with a pen pal overseas. Yet, each error triggered layers of consequence: internal memos scrutinized, other agents questioned, trust eroded, and the ever-present paranoia spread like a contagion. Agent X felt it seep into him, a cold awareness that no one, not even the most seasoned operatives, could be fully trusted. The leaks began subtly. A file surfaced in the wrong office, a memo misdirected to a field agent not involved in its surveillance. A senior analyst noticed irregularities in a data transmission. Whispers floated through corridors, half-heard comments that implied the impossible. Someone inside the CIA was deliberately sabotaging parts of the operation. Agent X's mind raced as he tried to reconcile logic with suspicion. Could an operative truly be playing both sides? Was it internal recklessness or a deliberate act of subversion? Every interaction was now tinged with doubt, every exchange a potential threat, every ally a possible betrayer. Paranoia became as much a weapon as any hidden microphone or planted informant. The web of deception grew tangled. Each day brought new revelations, most of them alarming. The innocent were treated with caution. The guilty were sometimes left untouched because evidence was insufficient. Agency directives required preemptive observation, but not confrontation. Yet the line between those two was constantly blurred. Agent X found himself reviewing photographs of gatherings that, in another life, he would have simply seen as meetings of concerned citizens. Now, each handshake, each whispered conversation, each glance was loaded with the possibility of treachery. He cataloged the smallest movements, tracing connections across continents, always aware that one misinterpretation could condemn someone unfairly. One afternoon, an activist he had come to respect, someone whose courage and dedication had impressed even his own morally conflicted conscience, was flagged as a suspected double agent. A series of innocuous actions, delayed reports, ambiguous meetings, private correspondence, were interpreted through the lens of suspicion, each fact magnified, each coincidence made sinister. Agent X's stomach tightened as he followed the evidence trail. It was meticulously constructed, convincingly persuasive, and yet inherently flawed. He knew it. He knew that this person was loyal, that their intentions were pure, and yet the system they were ensnared in had already drawn its conclusions. The weight of authority, combined with the machinery of surveillance, was capable of turning innocence into guilt with terrifying efficiency. The agency's internal communications were rife with tension. Analysts argued about ambiguous signals. Operatives in the field questioned the validity of their directives. Supervisors demanded immediate clarification that was impossible to provide. The internal web became a mirror of the surveillance network itself, a network of fear, suspicion, and uncertainty, each agent uncertain whether their colleagues could be trusted, each communication a potential trap. Agent X began to notice subtle signs of stress in his peers: hastily erased notes, nervous laughter during meetings, moments of silence that suggested deliberation over hidden agendas. Trust had become a commodity more precious than any piece of intelligence, yet far more fragile. Errors had consequences, both real and psychological. Innocent activists were subjected to intense scrutiny, their lives temporarily disrupted by phone taps, informal questioning, and casual infiltration. The knowledge that their every move could be monitored created unease, tension, and sometimes outright fear, even among those who had previously trusted each other implicitly. Agent X felt the ethical weight of it pressing down like a physical force. The realization that even well-intentioned surveillance could inflict psychological trauma. And yet, the mandate remained: continue, observe, record, and report. Moral ambiguity was not just tolerated, it was required. The suspected double agent, whose life hung precariously in the balance of misinterpretation, became the focal point of an internal debate. Some analysts pushed for direct confrontation, while others argued for continued observation. Agent X was acutely aware that his own actions could tip the scale, yet he was constrained by the machinery of bureaucracy, the chain of command, and the need for plausible deniability. Each day he walked a tighter line, balancing empathy against operational necessity, morality against obedience, and the truth against the perception of threat. Foreign intelligence collaborations added layers of complexity. Messages intercepted overseas, travel logs scrutinized, and liaison meetings coordinated in distant cities fed into the domestic operation, creating an international lattice of observation that was at once impressive and suffocating. Every citizen traveling abroad was a node in the network, every interaction potentially significant, and every innocent correspondence a possible misstep. The agency's reach had grown global, yet its certainty remained imperfect. The tension was relentless, a pressure that eroded sleep, patience, and sometimes reason. Secret file leaks compounded the paranoia. Internal investigations began to probe the possibility of a mole, and rumors circulated about who might be responsible. Agent X noted the subtle glances exchanged in the office, the slightly altered phrasing of communications, and the hesitation in reporting. The fear was pervasive. Even those not directly involved wondered if the system itself had become a weapon against them. The atmosphere was charged with suspicion, every conversation potentially significant, and every action potentially incriminating. Agent X found himself relying on intuition more than training, on observation more than protocol. He noticed patterns in colleague behavior, the way certain analysts avoided eye contact, the rapid erasure of data logs, the subtle inconsistencies in reports. Each observation could suggest sabotage, or it could be nothing. Yet, in a world governed by uncertainty, the margin for doubt was minimal. The psychological toll was undeniable. The agent, who once prided himself on rationality and discipline, now questioned motives, both external and internal, at every turn. Meanwhile, the activist mistakenly suspected of duplicity continued their daily work, unaware of the scrutiny. Their actions were now filtered through the lens of suspicion. Every engagement, every gesture, every word cataloged and debated. A simple act of kindness became a potential code, a private meeting with a colleague a suspected rendezvous. The misinterpretation amplified itself as reports circulated, memos were drafted, and the chain of command weighed its options. Agent X felt the weight of complicity pressing on him. He knew the truth, but was powerless to alter the machinery that had already misjudged it. The city itself became a stage for deception. Public protests proceeded under the surface tension of surveillance. Students, activists, and community leaders navigated routines layered with the unseen presence of operatives. The ordinary became extraordinary through the lens of intelligence. Mundane acts were interpreted as potential threats. Social interactions were reframed as tactical maneuvers. Agent X's own life mirrored this tension. The line between personal and professional blurred, and trust became a scarce commodity in every interaction. The CIA's intelligence apparatus operated with chilling efficiency, yet it was vulnerable to the imperfections of human judgment. Minor errors created disproportionate consequences, and the web of observation ensnared even those acting with complete integrity. Agent X was acutely aware that the operational focus on potential threats created a feedback loop. Suspicion bred scrutiny. Scrutiny bred errors. Errors bred more suspicion. The human element, in all its unpredictability, was both the object and the liability of the operation. As new protests were planned, the internal debate intensified. Some argued for preemptive disruption, others for continued surveillance. Agent X understood that the consequences of each choice were profound. Arrest, exposure, public scandal, or worse. He reviewed files, reanalyzed communications, and traced connections with painstaking care, aware that any misstep could trigger a cascade of unintended consequences. The tension was almost tangible, a pressure field within which every decision became an ethical and operational crucible. By nightfall, the operation had evolved into something unrecognizable from its original scope. The web of deception was no longer merely about monitoring potential foreign influence. It had become a system in which trust, morality, and truth were casualties of necessity. Agent X felt the strain in his bones, the weight of every decision, the ever-present awareness that lives were being shaped, and sometimes distorted, by the surveillance apparatus. Paranoia had become a structural element of the operation, infecting every corner, every agent, every file. And as he prepared for the next day, when protests, meetings, and interactions would resume under the watchful gaze of a network stretched across continents, Agent X understood a terrifying reality. In the web of deception, certainty was impossible. Innocence could be misinterpreted as guilt, and even the most careful agent could become a pawn in a system that measured human behavior not by intent, but by perceived risk. Somewhere, an innocent activist continued their work, unaware that the machinery of suspicion had already turned their life into a question, a potential threat, a target in a game whose rules were written in shadows and enforced with cold precision. The web had tightened, the storm had not passed, and the next move, whatever it might be, promised consequences that would ripple far beyond the immediate circle of observation. Every agent, every file, every interaction was now a node in a lattice of paranoia. And in that lattice, Agent X realized with a jolt that no one, not the leaders, not the operatives, not even himself, could be trusted to act with absolute clarity, and that the operation had become something far more dangerous than simple intelligence gathering. It had become a test of morality under the unblinking eye of power, with no clear end in sight. The air in the office had grown thick with the scent of stale coffee, paper, and the subtle, persistent tension that seemed to cling to every surface. Agent X leaned over his desk, eyes fixed on a file that had grown heavier, with meaning, or perhaps with consequence. The numbers and names no longer merely represented intelligence. They had become living, breathing entities in his mind, each dossier a story, each intercepted conversation a thread in a tapestry that he could no longer disentangle from his own conscience. The machinery of Operation Chaos had expanded beyond logic, beyond protocol, and now into a space that no manual could ever account for, the human soul. There, in the dim lamplight, He realized that every act of surveillance, every phone tapped, every shadow followed, felt like a betrayal, not only of the targets, but of the principles he had once believed in. His thoughts were interrupted by the quiet tap of a junior recruit at the door. A boy barely out of college, nervous and earnest, holding a folder in his trembling hands. "Agent X," he said, voice low. "They want me to follow my friend." The request was simple in its phrasing, brutal in its implications. A personal friend, someone whose trust he had earned, was now a target, and the young recruit had been ordered to spy on them. Agent X felt a cold jolt of recognition, the same exact tension, the same exact moral fissure, mirrored in someone just starting down the path he himself had been forced onto years ago. He tried to steady the boy with a wordless gesture, but the futility of it sank in immediately. No comfort could erase the path he was being asked to tread. I don't know if I can," the boy whispered, eyes darting toward the door as if the walls themselves were listening. Agent X's chest tightened. He understood the stakes. Hesitation here was not simply moral. It was operationally dangerous. A mistake could unravel months of surveillance, expose informants, or compromise the entire network. Yet, obedience felt indistinguishable from complicity, and complicity felt indistinguishable from betrayal. He leaned closer, voice barely audible. "You have to think about what comes after, not just the mission, but yourself. Don't lose yourself in this." The boy swallowed hard, nodding, yet Agent X knew that nod carried no absolution, no guarantee against the erosion of conscience that would inevitably follow. Whistleblowers had begun to surface as rumors, threads of danger that snaked through the agency's vast corridors. Conversations overheard in casual offices, notes left carelessly in the wrong inbox, cryptic phone calls, all hinted at a threat that could unravel Operation Chaos from within. The agency itself seemed perched on a knife's edge. One exposed file, one misstep, and the carefully constructed web of surveillance, deception, and manipulation could collapse, leaving reputations ruined, lives exposed, and the entire covert network vulnerable to public outrage or political fallout. Agent X felt the tension like a physical weight, pressing down, constricting, reminding him that every action, every decision was now a gamble with human lives as the stakes. Night descended, but it brought no respite. Agent X paced through the narrow hallways of his apartment, the hum of the city outside failing to drown out the storm in his mind. Sleep had become a distant memory, replaced by obsessive reflection, and the gnawing fear that every step, every assignment, every directive was a choice between degrees of moral compromise. He replayed interactions over and over. The young recruit's hesitation, the activist misidentified as a double agent, the informant whose misinterpretation had nearly exposed them all. Each scenario was a loop, a spiral deeper into what he began to think of as moral quicksand. Once you stepped in, every movement could pull you further into the mire, every attempt at resolution leaving you more entangled than before. Files spread across his desk became landscapes of guilt. Names blurred, events merged, and the emotional weight of observation pressed on him like the tide of an unrelenting sea. He read transcripts of conversations he had recorded, listening to voices he had once dismissed as potential threats, and now recognizing their humanity in a way that was almost unbearable. A laugh shared over a small triumph, a whispered expression of doubt, a conversation about family and hope. These were not intelligence anomalies. These were human lives, rich, messy, and full of trust, now cataloged as potential risks in the cold ledger of surveillance. The young recruit's presence lingered in his mind, a mirror of his own early days, and Agent X found himself questioning how far one could go in obedience before the line between duty and moral corruption vanished entirely. He thought of the countless operatives, each carrying secrets that could haunt them, each participating in a system that eroded innocence through incremental, almost imperceptible actions. The psychological toll was cumulative. Each act of surveillance became a subtle wound. Each report submitted a mark against conscience. He could feel it accumulating like sediment, layering guilt upon guilt, until clarity was a memory, and all that remained was the murky necessity of observation and manipulation. In the midst of this, a critical error surfaced in the network. A misinterpreted signal from a foreign contact suggested a potential threat that did not exist. The resulting chain reaction rippled through field agents, who began to act on the false information, placing both targets and operatives at unnecessary risk. Panic subtly infiltrated meetings, and internal memos betrayed traces of fear. Decisions that should have been routine became fraught with apprehension. Agent X monitored the fallout, aware that inaction was as dangerous as action, and yet every option seemed morally compromised. The dichotomy of operational necessity versus ethical integrity was no longer theoretical. It was immediate, pressing, and suffocating. Sleepless nights deepened his obsession. He lay awake, listening to the wind, imagining scenarios where every friend, every informant, every activist he had once cataloged acted unpredictably, their intentions misunderstood, their innocence weaponized against them. The boundaries between real threats and imagined dangers blurred. His mind became a labyrinth, populated with shadows of people whose lives were intertwined with his own decisions, and he understood with grim clarity that the operation had transformed him into a conduit for consequences he could neither control nor fully predict. Each morning he returned to his desk with a growing sense of dread. Surveillance reports, intercepted communications, field logs, they had become instruments of unease. The more he learned, the less certain he became, and the more he hesitated, knowing that hesitation could be just as perilous as overzealous action. He watched agents around him operate with rigid efficiency, their faces masks of composure. Yet, beneath those masks, he sensed the same unrest, the same gnawing weight of conscience. Every operative was haunted by their own deeds, every decision a potential scar on the psyche. A minor incident pushed the tension to a new height. A field agent, following standard protocol, misreported an activist's movement, claiming clandestine foreign contact. The error triggered immediate response protocols, field deployments, and internal alerts, all based on a misunderstanding. Agent X was forced to reconcile the operational necessity of immediate action with the moral certainty that innocent individuals were now being subjected to unwarranted surveillance. His mind raced, replaying the sequence over and over, calculating consequences, imagining reputational damage, social fallout, and the psychological impact on those being observed. Sleep remained elusive. Thoughts spiraled, unchecked and relentless. Paranoia became pervasive. Every conversation, even in casual contexts, was analyzed, filtered, and cross-referenced against patterns, behaviors, and historical data. Agent X found that even interactions outside the agency, moments with friends, brief encounters on the street, snippets of overheard dialogue, took on new significance. Trust had become a foreign language, communication, a potential vector for error, and every personal connection a potential liability. The moral landscape was no longer black and white, but a gradient of increasingly uncomfortable gray, with no solid ground to anchor his conscience. The young recruit returned, eyes wide with unspoken dread. I followed him," he admitted haltingly. Agent X felt a pang of recognition, an echo of his own early missteps, and a profound sorrow for the innocents being compromised. The agent's voice was quiet, almost a whisper. "You survived it, but you must remember what that means. Every choice has weight. Every action leaves a shadow." He saw the boy's shoulders tense, the subtle shudder of a young mind grappling with moral complexity that few should have to face at that age. And yet, within that shadow, he also saw resilience, a fragile light that could endure if guided carefully. Threats of whistleblowers intensified. Internal rumors suggested files had been leaked to media sources, that portions of the operation might already be exposed. The agency's leadership convened intense secrecy, weighing damage control against continued surveillance, grappling with the realization that internal mistrust could collapse months of planning in an instant. Agent X listened, contributing when necessary, yet feeling powerless in the face of forces that extended beyond his own control. His role had become simultaneously central and negligible, a witness to a moral quagmire he could neither resolve nor escape. Time became elastic, stretched by insomnia and obsessive reflection. Days and nights blurred, the calendar rendered meaningless by constant monitoring, urgent memos, and the creeping psychological burden of ethical compromise. Agent X found himself retracing actions, re-examining decisions, considering whether he could have acted differently, should have intervened sooner, or refrained entirely. Sleep, rest, and relief were luxuries denied. The moral quicksand beneath his feet demanded constant vigilance, unrelenting awareness, and a willingness to bear consequences both personal and professional. The psychological cost became increasingly apparent. He noticed the haunted expressions of colleagues, the quiet tremors in their hands, the subtle signs of stress manifesting as impatience, irritability, and withdrawal. The machinery of surveillance had created a system in which operational efficiency was preserved at the expense of mental stability, and the human toll was mounting. Agent X understood with chilling clarity that the cost of the mission was not abstract. It was tangible, it was intimate, and it was unavoidable. Even the successes of the operation were shadowed by moral ambiguity. The accurate identification of genuine threats brought no solace. The lives altered, the trust broken, and the ethical compromises endured created a persistent ache, a residue that could not be erased by strategic gains. Agent X found that the lines between right and wrong, duty and betrayal, observer and participant, had dissolved into a landscape of perpetual moral tension, where each action carried unintended consequences and inaction was no longer neutral. The city moved around him, oblivious to the invisible battles being waged. Students, activists, and everyday citizens continued their routines, unaware that a vast web of observation, suspicion, and control threaded through their lives. Agent X's own reflection in the window was almost unrecognizable. Eyes rimmed with fatigue, jaw set tight, hands trembling slightly from the constant, low-level adrenaline of unrelenting vigilance. He understood that he had become a ghost in a world he once sought to understand, a specter of surveillance who was as trapped by conscience as he was by duty. And yet, in the darkness of the night, in the quiet hours when reports were filed and streets emptied, he recognized the human cost, not just in others, but in himself. Operation Chaos had achieved technical mastery, operational reach, and bureaucratic sophistication. Yet, it exacted a price measured not in intelligence metrics, but in human anguish. Agent X realized that the mission's greatest casualty was not the targets, but the agents themselves, haunted by their own deeds, caught in moral quicksand, with no solid ground in sight, and that the true danger was no longer external. It was internal, ethical, and inexorably personal. The night was quiet, deceptively so, as if the city itself was holding its breath. Agent X moved through the empty streets with practiced caution, every shadow a potential observer, every footstep a possible giveaway. His mind, already frayed from the moral quicksand he had been wading through, now teetered on the edge of sheer vigilance. Activists he had once monitored with confident detachment were beginning to notice anomalies. Friends disappearing momentarily, messages arriving late, someone always just out of reach. Subtle glances in cafes, whispered warnings between comrades, the faintest flicker of suspicion in a familiar face. It all compounded into a pressure that threatened to collapse the network from within. The first close call came without warning. A protest organizer, normally composed and cautious, lingered near a series of public phones where Agent X had previously tapped lines. The man's suspicion was piqued, though not overtly expressed, and Agent X felt the sudden piercing awareness that a single misstep could unravel months of meticulous surveillance. He adjusted his route, slowed his pace, and reminded himself of the basics: anticipate, evade, observe without being seen. Every movement was calculated, every action measured against the possibility of exposure. He thought of the young recruit, of the activist misidentified as a double agent, and the cumulative weight of these near disasters pressed on him like a physical burden. Meetings moved to dimly lit basements, rooms chosen for their obscurity and distance from casual surveillance. The air was thick with dust and unspoken tension. Code words were exchanged in low murmurs. Microfilm was discreetly transferred in lipstick tubes, concealed behind trivial props that no casual observer would notice. Books were stacked just so, leaving gaps where messages could be hidden for agents to retrieve later. Each maneuver was a testament to the ingenuity and caution required in domestic espionage. Simple in principle, but deadly in consequence if executed poorly. Agent X traced the lines of communication with painstaking precision, understanding that the slightest error could expose not just him, but every operative in the field. Even within the agency, fear was beginning to circulate. Whispers of leaks, of journalists sniffing out patterns, spread like wildfire. One reporter, persistent and unusually perceptive, had begun to connect dots. Civil rights protests coinciding with unusual federal activity, student demonstrations mirrored by surveillance memos, cryptic references in public records that hinted at a network operating in the shadows. The journalist had yet to fully uncover the operation, but Agent X knew how quickly one clever observer could tip the balance, turning months of covert effort into a public spectacle. Each day felt like walking a tightrope over an abyss, the wire slick with uncertainty, and the wind of exposure threatening to topple him at any moment. Improvisation became a survival skill. When one dead drop point was compromised, another had to be created on the fly, often minutes before a meeting. Code phrases were altered, locations shifted, timing recalibrated. Microfilm was tucked into hollowed-out items, cigarette packs, lipstick tubes, pens, anything that could conceal intelligence in plain sight. Agents shadowed targets and each other in intricate tailing maneuvers, swapping roles seamlessly to avoid detection. A glance too long, a gesture too casual, a momentary lapse in attention could betray the entire operation, and the knowledge that failure was catastrophic weighed on everyone involved. Agent X himself faced an escalating sense of vulnerability. While coordinating field operatives, he noticed that patterns of behavior among activists were adapting. Routes had changed, meetings were delayed, and previously reliable dead drops were being avoided. Each alteration was a signal, a puzzle that required instant interpretation. Could it be coincidence? Or had someone noticed too much? The uncertainty gnawed at him, amplifying the tension he carried from moral compromises and sleepless nights. He replayed interactions mentally, imagining every possible scenario, every potential exposure, every misstep that could reveal his identity. A near discovery intensified the peril. One evening, while exchanging a microfilm, a pedestrian lingered a fraction too long, eyes scanning the book stack where messages had been concealed. Agent X froze, counting heartbeats, calculating risk. The person moved on, casual but observant, leaving Agent X with the bitter knowledge that the margin between anonymity and exposure had been wafer thin. Later, in a basement meeting with fellow operatives, he described the encounter, and the room went silent. They all understood what it meant. The operation was alive, not just in data, but in awareness, and someone had nearly stumbled across its pulse. The psychological strain was mirrored in the youngest agents. The recruit tasked with spying on his friend now faced real danger. The activist had begun noticing discrepancies in behavior, and minor inconsistencies were adding up. Each surveillance assignment felt like stepping into a minefield, where one wrong movement could trigger revelation. Agent X tried to coach him through the stress, emphasizing discipline and subtlety. Yet, he could feel the boy's growing anxiety as a palpable force, one that mirrored his own internal tremors. In the field, even routine operations became high-stakes improvisation. A courier transporting documents had to change routes 3 times in one night, avoiding areas where journalists or vigilant civilians might be present. Dead drops were executed in near silence, microfilm transferred with hands trembling under pressure. Code words were repeated, altered, and reinforced, a ritual of vigilance that demanded absolute focus. Any lapse could mean exposure, and exposure now carried heavier consequences than ever before. Arrests, public scrutiny, operational collapse. Journalists and activists alike began to sense a presence, a shadow that followed without being seen. Small anomalies, books out of place, messages arriving in unexpected forms, patterns too precise to be natural, raised the alarm. Agent X's mind raced to anticipate these reactions, to calculate every probability, and to create contingencies that might keep the network intact. Yet, even the best planning could not eliminate uncertainty. The possibility that a single perceptive individual could unravel the entire operation remained a constant threat. The thrill of close calls became a psychic burden. Each narrow escape left a residue of tension, a lingering adrenaline that sharpened perception but exhausted the mind. Agent X often sat alone after operations, replaying events, calculating the margin of error, imagining how easily a single mistake could expose his cover. He recognized that the personal stakes had become inseparable from operational ones. To fail professionally was to fail personally, and the cost of exposure could extend far beyond the individual to touch innocent lives. An encounter late one night brought that realization into sharp focus. A street activist, whom he had previously monitored from a distance, suddenly looked in his direction for a fraction of a second too long, recognition flashing in the eyes of someone who sensed being watched. Agent X felt the familiar spike of fear, the instinctive tightening of muscles, the surge of mental calculation that assessed every option, every escape route, every contingency. The city seemed to hold its breath with him, the shadows now alive with risk. Internal communications were equally perilous. Messages sent via code were intercepted by vigilant analysts scanning for anomalies, and any mistake could draw attention to the network. Agent X became hyper-aware of language, phrasing, even timing, recognizing that operational security depended on both precision and intuition. Each day was a high-wire act performed in darkness, with the constant knowledge that one misstep could unravel months of work. Yet, perhaps the most dangerous close calls were internal. Trust had eroded so thoroughly that agents questioned each other, alliances were tenuous, and even minor discrepancies sparked suspicion. The web of surveillance, once a tool of clarity, now created a mirror in which every operator saw potential betrayal reflected back. Agent X knew that the network's survival depended on absolute discretion, but the human element, fear, stress, fatigue, introduced unpredictability at every turn. The culmination of these tensions brought a single, piercing moment of crisis. While coordinating a complex handoff of microfilm concealed in innocuous items, Agent X realized that a fellow operative had deviated from the agreed protocol. The deviation, seemingly minor, exposed a gap that could allow identification of several agents, including himself. He calculated options in milliseconds: abort, intervene, or adapt. Each carried risk, each carried moral ambiguity. He chose the path that offered the best chance of protection without immediate exposure, and executed it with clinical precision. Yet, the knowledge of how close he had come to disaster lingered like a phantom wound. By the time he returned to his quarters, exhaustion and fear coalesced into a pervasive awareness that the operation was precarious and that his own identity hung in balance. Even minor miscalculations could set off a chain reaction that would expose months of covert work, imperil lives, and dismantle the network from within. The thought of being unmasked, of his carefully constructed persona being stripped away, pressed against him with the force of inevitability. He understood that the thrill of the mission had merged irrevocably with a terror of exposure, creating a tension that was as inescapable as it was unrelenting. And as he sat in silence, reviewing the day's events and replaying every movement, every interaction, every near miss, he understood the harsh truth. In the world of domestic espionage, every close call was a reminder that safety was an illusion. Anonymity was fragile, and the next moment could change everything. Somewhere in the city, someone might have already sensed him, and the knowledge that his own identity teetered on the edge of revelation made the shadows around him feel both protective and suffocating at once. The operation continued, but the tension had reached a new apex, and Agent X, along with every agent in the field, knew that the next encounter could be decisive, unforgiving, and irreversible. The morning air carried a strange weight, a tension that felt different from any of the calculated anxieties Agent X had endured over the years. It was not the subtle, slow burn unease of surveillance, or the nervous adrenaline of near discoveries. It was the cold, electrifying certainty that the walls of secrecy had begun to crumble. Seymour Hersh's byline had appeared, sprawling across newspapers and wire services, and the words leaped from the page with the force of a shockwave. The CIA had been spying on Americans, not foreign targets, not adversaries abroad, but its own citizens, its own neighbors, its own people. For years, every whisper recorded, every footstep traced, every protest infiltrated, had been justified in the name of national security, and now the illusion of necessity had been ripped away, exposing the raw mechanics of deceit to the world. Agent X felt the phone vibrate on his desk with a subtle menace, a reminder that the internal communications he had relied upon were now a potential trail leading straight to him. The report detailed operations, field techniques, and lists of activists and civil rights leaders, people he had watched, cataloged, and sometimes, in moments of quiet despair, come to respect. The sheer scale of the revelation was staggering, and the emotional cost of complicity suddenly transformed from a private burden into a public reckoning. Agents who had operated in shadows now faced the harsh light of scrutiny, and every carefully maintained alias, every concealed recording device, every clandestine drop could become evidence against them. The offices of the CIA were a hive of tense activity, the air thick with whispered consultations, hurried memos, and the faint, unmistakable smell of panic. Meetings were convened to assess damage, to determine legal exposure, and to coordinate immediate protective measures for operatives in the field. Agent X listened to the discussions with a detached awareness that only years in covert operations could cultivate. Yet even detachment could not protect him from the gnawing realization that everything he had done, every ethical compromise, every sleepless night spent orchestrating surveillance, was now laid bare to the public eye. Questions swirled like a tempest. What would happen to the young recruit he had mentored? What of the activists whose trust had been broken? What of the citizens who had once felt safe, oblivious to the watchful eyes hidden in their midst? The media coverage was relentless, each story a hammer striking at the edifice of secrecy that had cloaked the operation. Public outrage mounted as Americans grappled with the realization that the government they trusted had systematically monitored their private lives, often without legal justification. For many, it was a betrayal too intimate to be abstract. Parents whispered anxiously about the privacy of their children. Students remembered conversations they thought were safe, and citizens reflected on the strange coincidences that had suddenly taken on sinister significance. Agent X felt it all as a physical pulse, a vibration that resonated through the city and through the network he had helped maintain. Amid this turbulence, agents were summoned individually, called in for questioning, sometimes by hostile congressional committees, sometimes by internal investigators who had only just realized the depth of the operational entanglement. Agent X moved through the corridors of authority with a cautious, almost imperceptible precision, aware that a single misstep could expose his identity, and with it unravel every connection he had painstakingly managed. Each question asked, each document reviewed, Each interaction became a minefield, the stakes elevated not by the danger of foreign adversaries, but by the precarious balance between truth, loyalty, and survival. Citizens' trust, already a fragile thing, fractured spectacularly. Families debated over the dinner table whether their own rights had been violated, friends whispered anxiously about whether private conversations might have been monitored, and community leaders condemned actions once justified in the abstract logic of Cold War necessity. The emotional resonance of betrayal was visceral. It was not simply political scandal, but a rupture in the social fabric. Agent X, moving through the fallout, sensed the cumulative weight of surveillance, moral compromise, and operational secrecy manifesting in every corner of the public sphere. Yet, even as the operation faced exposure and scrutiny, a darker, more unsettling realization emerged. Not all data had been accounted for. Some files, some recordings, some microfilm were missing, absent from archives, absent from investigative documentation, absent from any chain of custody that could be confirmed. Whispers of rogue elements operating independently, agents acting outside sanctioned parameters, and unauthorized surveillance continued to circulate in the halls of the agency. The revelation was not just that Operation Chaos had existed, but that the full scope of what had been done and what might still be ongoing was uncertain. Every analyst, every operative, every investigator understood that the operational landscape was now fractured, unpredictable, and potentially still dangerous. Agent X moved carefully, calculating both professional and personal ramifications. He knew that even a single misaligned report, a minor error, could implicate him or his colleagues in criminal or civil proceedings. The psychological strain was enormous. Years of training, moral compromises, and sleepless nights now distilled into an unrelenting tension that threatened to undo the very operatives the agency sought to protect. While the world outside debated legality, morality, and oversight, those who had lived in the shadows understood that exposure was both a legal and existential threat. In one particularly tense sequence, Agent X attended a meeting with internal auditors who meticulously combed through records, questioning procedural decisions, cross-referencing logs, and seeking to determine how many civilians had been targeted and why. Every answer, every clarification, was weighed against both legal precedent and operational necessity, and Agent X realized that the interrogation was as much about survival as accountability. The conversation circled around him like a predator, probing, calculating, assessing vulnerabilities. Every false impression, every subtle misstatement could trigger consequences he could not control. Meanwhile, the public narrative evolved rapidly. Civil liberties organizations decried the surveillance, demanding transparency and prosecution. Media outlets published detailed accounts of CIA operatives attending rallies, following students, and cataloging citizens. Names, once anonymous in internal files, became publicly debated figures, their privacy violated, their lives dissected. Agent X felt a deep, personal resonance with the fear and outrage he witnessed. For years, he had justified his actions under the banner of national security, but now he confronted the tangible emotional impact of those justifications. A society left questioning the sanctity of private life and the morality of its protectors. The emotional climax reached its apex when citizens began recounting interactions that had previously seemed innocuous, but now were charged with suspicion. Conversations in classrooms, whispered debates in cafes, and even casual exchanges at community centers were reevaluated in the harsh light of public disclosure. Agent X realized with an almost paralyzing clarity that the operation's reach had extended far beyond immediate intelligence gathering. It had reshaped trust itself, leaving relationships, institutions, and communities fractured. The moral and social consequences were no longer theoretical. They were experienced, deeply felt, and irreversibly impactful. Yet, the twist of missing data gnawed at Agent X like an unseen predator. Internal records suggested anomalies. reports filed without original documentation, microfilm unaccounted for, and unexplained gaps in the surveillance archive. Rogue agents may have continued operations beyond official sanction. Segments of intelligence could still be active, hidden, and untraceable. The very system he had once relied upon for control and certainty now contained elements of unpredictability and threat, not just externally, but internally. The knowledge that hidden strands of the operation might persist in the shadows intensified every calculation, every step, and every decision he made. As the public debate raged and internal investigations intensified, Agent X understood that his existence in the network, once a controlled equation of anonymity and influence, was now precarious. Every move carried the weight of potential exposure, legal liability, and moral reckoning. The thrill and discipline of covert operations had given way to a pervasive tension in which trust was scarce, certainty impossible, and the risk of irrevocable consequences omnipresent. He recognized that Operation Chaos, once a carefully orchestrated machinery of national security, had become a mirror reflecting the complex, often uncomfortable interplay between power, secrecy, and human fallibility. Even as hearings continued and journalists dissected the operation with relentless precision, Agent X remained vigilant. Every meeting, every message, every phone call could serve as a vector for discovery. The network he had helped construct was compromised, yet fragments persisted, hints of rogue elements continuing their work, independent and unaccountable. This realization transformed every routine task into a calculated risk, every decision a moral and strategic gamble. He understood, with a deep, inescapable clarity, that exposure was not simply a moment in time. It was a continuum of danger, a web extending in unpredictable directions, and that the consequences, both public and private, would reverberate long after the headlines faded. And in the silence of his apartment, long after the reporters had filed their stories, and the city seemed to resume its daily rhythm, Agent X felt the weight of history pressing down. The revelation of Operation Chaos was not simply an operational failure or a bureaucratic scandal. It was a human story of trust betrayed, conscience tested, and a society confronted with the reality that the protectors it relied upon had crossed the most intimate boundaries. And somewhere, in the labyrinth of missing files and hidden operations, the operation's shadow still lingered, a subtle yet persistent reminder that not all secrets were exposed, and that the line between exposure and continuation was thinner than anyone dared imagine. Even as the last headlines of Operation Chaos faded from the front pages, a different kind of storm gathered in the corridors of power, quieter but no less relentless. Agent X watched from a distance, feeling the tremors of change ripple through both the agency and the nation. The Rockefeller Commission convened with an austere formality that masked the gravity of its inquiries, while the Church Committee prepared a meticulous, probing investigation into years of domestic espionage, the lives disrupted, and the moral compromises that had been rationalized under the banner of national security. The hearings were punctuated by long silences, carefully chosen words, and the palpable tension of a bureaucracy forced to confront the consequences of secrecy. Witnesses described the hidden mechanisms of surveillance, files meticulously cataloged on unsuspecting citizens, operations conducted with surgical precision yet moral ambiguity, agents working without oversight, and communities infiltrated by shadows. Agent X sat in a quiet corner, reviewing transcripts in his mind, reliving every decision, every ethical compromise, every night spent calculating risks in the darkness. The hearings were public, yet their impact was personal. Citizens saw the evidence, the numbers, the meticulous intelligence gathering that had crossed into invasive monitoring. But for Agent X and his colleagues, it was more intimate. The faces of friends and activists, once distant data points, now occupied the same space in memory as the moral cost of each action. He reflected on the young recruit who had hesitated to spy on a friend, on activists whose lives were disrupted by paranoia and misinterpretation, and on the slow erosion of his own sense of purpose. What had been justified in the name of protection now revealed the full magnitude of its human toll. The subtle psychological injuries inflicted by surveillance, fear, distrust, suspicion, could not be quantified in congressional reports or media columns, yet they persisted in the public consciousness like an invisible scar. Policy reforms were imposed in the wake of the hearings, sweeping changes designed to prevent recurrence, to enforce oversight, to constrain the reach of clandestine operations within national borders. Restrictions were enacted, approvals required, reporting formalized, and limits imposed on domestic intelligence activities. Yet, beneath the surface, the machinery of surveillance, smaller, subtler, more precise, continued to hum quietly. Techniques refined during chaos were adapted, operational experience retained, and a new generation of operatives trained to operate within the letter of the law while retaining the capability to act in secrecy. Agent X, now distant from daily field operations, understood this with a mixture of relief and foreboding. The visible threat had been curtailed, but the latent capability, the hidden threat, persisted. In quiet moments, Agent X revisited memories of the city streets, the cafes, the student quads, the basements, and the book stacks. Each location carried traces of surveillance, of tension, of the invisible lines connecting agents, targets, and information. The emotional residue of these operations was profound. Sleepless nights, moral compromises, and the constant calculation of risk had left him with a psychological landscape of unease and vigilance. He understood that the lessons of chaos were not merely historical, they were enduring, shaping the mindset of operatives, the expectations of institutions, and the invisible boundaries of privacy in a modernizing society. The public discourse, meanwhile, oscillated between outrage and resignation. Citizens debated the morality of domestic intelligence, the delicate balance between security and liberty, and the implicit understanding that even as reforms were imposed, the threat of subtle surveillance was not entirely extinguished. Agent X felt a chill as he considered this. The shadow of chaos extended beyond the immediate revelations, foreshadowing techniques and practices that would evolve into the digital age: wiretaps, electronic monitoring, the gathering of metadata, the silent observation of online activity. The tension, the friction between oversight and secrecy, freedom and safety, remained, subtly threading through the fabric of American life, shaping perceptions and behavior in ways both visible and unseen. He thought of the citizens whose private lives had been catalogued, who had been observed without consent, and who now questioned the institutions they once trusted. The emotional cost was layered: fear of exposure, mistrust of authority, and the lingering uncertainty that surveillance could persist in forms they could neither see nor anticipate. For Agent X, the reflection was profoundly personal. He had navigated these operations with precision and discipline, yet the human consequences, the subtle erosion of trust, the internalization of fear, were as tangible as any operational success or failure. Each file collected, each operation executed, each contact monitored had a ripple effect far beyond the immediate objective. Amid this reflection, the latent threat became more evident. Rogue elements, hidden capacities, and intelligence networks adapted to oversight continued to operate under the radar and maintained the knowledge that secrecy was both a tool and a shield. The tension between public accountability and operational capability was unbroken. Agent X understood that while hearings, commissions, and reforms created the illusion of closure, the machinery of surveillance had evolved into a more concealed, sophisticated, and enduring force. The shadows had not disappeared. They had merely retreated, waiting in the periphery, ready to re-emerge when circumstance demanded. In the quiet of his apartment, Agent X considered the paradox that defined his existence and that of the operation he had once served. Chaos had been exposed, and yet, in subtle ways, it persisted. The nation had been forced to confront the moral, legal, and emotional implications of domestic surveillance. But the invisible architecture of observation remained, leaving both citizens and operatives with a lingering tension. Privacy had been violated, trust shattered, and society left to grapple with the knowledge that vigilance and secrecy were enduring companions. The hidden threat, though no longer overt, was now intertwined with the collective consciousness. Americans had glimpsed the machinery of covert oversight, and Agent X recognized that the consequences were ongoing. A subtle paranoia, a heightened awareness of observation, and the quiet, almost imperceptible extension of operational capability into new domains. He thought about how future generations might inherit this tension, how the lessons of chaos could inform both policy and personal behavior, and how the invisible scars of secrecy would continue to shape society long after the public attention had faded. Every reflection, every memory, and every lingering awareness served as a reminder. Exposure was temporary, scrutiny was fleeting, but the capabilities and human instincts that had powered chaos were enduring. The nation had survived the revelation, yet the psychological, ethical, and operational echoes of the operation persisted, creating a continuum in which vigilance and morality, secrecy and accountability would forever be in uneasy balance. Agent X understood, with an almost tangible weight pressing on his consciousness, that the story of chaos was not one that concluded with congressional hearings or media exposés. It was a narrative of hidden threads, moral complexity, and perpetual tension, a shadow that stretched far beyond the confines of time, history, and oversight, reaching forward into an uncertain present and a future that had yet to reckon with the full cost of secrecy. The world had moved forward, but the shadows of chaos stretched longer than most would admit, curling into the corners of technology, law, and human perception. Agent X, older now, carrying the invisible scars of decades in secrecy, felt them acutely as he watched the evolution of intelligence unfold before him. The revelations of the 1970s had shifted public consciousness, yet the machinery of observation had adapted, learned, and endured far beyond congressional hearings, reforms, and public outrage. Surveillance had become subtler, smarter, integrated into systems that blurred the line between legitimate security and covert intrusion. Where once the CIA had relied on human agents, dead drops, and microfilm, now metadata, digital footprints, and encrypted communications replaced footsteps and whispers. The moral dilemmas had grown more abstract, yet no less profound. Agent X pondered how easily human behavior could be quantified, how patterns could be predicted, how connections could be mapped without the observed ever suspecting a thing. The chilling realization settled in like a physical weight. Chaos had not ended. It had evolved. The principles, the instincts, the operational philosophies endured in new forms. AI systems, algorithms designed to detect anomalies in behavior, now carried out the very work he had once performed in shadows, guided by rules but devoid of conscience. The citizens of the modern era, unaware of the continuity between past and present, lived with a false sense of security, unaware that the lessons learned from spies, informants, and clandestine files had been encoded into the infrastructure of daily life. He thought back to young recruits, the hesitant operative who once questioned the ethics of watching a friend, and the activists who unknowingly danced with agents in their midst. The human cost had been immeasurable, emotional wounds invisible but real. Now, in the digital age, the consequences were magnified. A single keystroke, a photograph, a GPS ping could create a map of a life, a network, an entire community. And yet, the public perception remained that exposure had ended with the Rockefeller Commission. That oversight had curtailed the reach of secret intelligence. Agent X knew better. The echoes of chaos persisted, reshaping the relationship between power and privacy, surveillance and liberty, in ways both overt and imperceptible. He remembered the thrill, the paranoia, the quiet victories, and the devastating ethical compromises. The adrenaline of close calls, the sickening weight of betrayal, the nights spent cataloging human behavior without consent. All of it had left a residue that modern systems could replicate with clinical precision. Intelligence professionals now had access to tools beyond imagination, yet the ethical questions remained fundamentally unchanged. How far should observation extend? When does the pursuit of security erode the very freedoms it claims to protect? And if a system can watch everyone, who watches the watchers? These were not theoretical quandaries. They were the living, breathing legacy of chaos. On a quiet evening, as Agent X reviewed an archive of declassified documents, a notification pinged on a smartphone in a nearby room. The device was unassuming, yet the message it carried was encrypted, a string of characters that hinted at clandestine communication far beyond the oversight of ordinary eyes. He knew instantly that the protocols behind it were descendants of the very operations he had once served. The thrill of recognition was tinged with unease. Surveillance had become omnipresent, silent, and almost impossible to contest. A line of code here, a pattern there, and the work of chaos continued, hidden in plain sight. He traced the code, realizing that even decades later, the infrastructure, both human and technological, still bore the fingerprints of those long-forgotten operations. The realization was simultaneously awe-inspiring and terrifying. Chaos was no longer a historical footnote, it was a living organism, encoded into networks, systems, and behavioral analysis that continued to observe, record, and influence. Citizens went about their lives believing in privacy, yet their digital traces were mapped, analyzed, and interpreted in ways reminiscent of the microfilm files, surveillance notes, and clandestine recordings of the past. The parallel was stark. The tools had changed, the scale had increased, but the core premise remained the same. The need to know, to anticipate, to control, humanity's instinct cloaked in the guise of national security, was unchanged, just repackaged for the modern age. Agent X reflected on the finality of his own personal journey. The faces of those he had surveilled, the moral compromises he had made, and the sleepless nights filled with ethical uncertainty were etched permanently into his consciousness. He had lived in the tension between service and conscience, between loyalty and morality. And now, decades later, he understood that this tension had not vanished. It had simply been inherited by systems, algorithms, and operators who may never comprehend the full human consequences of their actions. He felt a pang of both pride and regret. The work had protected a nation in some measure, yet it had also betrayed the very people it was meant to serve. The emotional and ethical cost remained immeasurable. The final twist came almost imperceptibly. Among the files he reviewed, tucked into a digital archive, was a fragment of microfilm, barely cataloged, a remnant of chaos-era surveillance. Its presence was a subtle yet undeniable signal. The operations, the patterns, the mindset, and the infrastructure he had once operated within had never truly ended. It persisted in hidden servers, encrypted communication channels, and analytic models capable of extrapolating private behavior on an unprecedented scale. The audience, if they were to imagine themselves in his position, would feel the disquieting truth that the past was not merely past, it had seeped into the present, into the devices they trusted, into the systems they took for granted, quietly shaping decisions, behavior, and perception. As he sat there, absorbing the weight of legacy, a lingering message appeared on a screen, a sequence of numbers and symbols, untraceable, encrypted, sent without warning, a whisper from shadows still alive. Agent X understood immediately that the work, the philosophy, the reach of chaos had endured. The message did not reveal a threat, but it reminded him, and the audience alongside him, that the machinery of observation was not bound by history. Surveillance was continuous, evolving, imperceptible, and unavoidable. It was a mirror held up to society, reflecting both its vulnerabilities and its complicity, leaving a question that could never fully be answered. How much of our lives remain truly our own, and at what cost have we traded freedom for security? And with that final haunting realization, the story of Operation Chaos concluded not with closure, but with an uneasy echo that reverberated into the present, leaving Agent X and those who followed the narrative with a profound sense of disquiet, an unsettling awareness that the Watchers had not disappeared, they had simply changed form, and in doing so had ensured that the shadows of chaos would forever linger.